welcome, please, to Alan Foster.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So the title of this talk today is Communication with Extraterrestrial Intelligence. Now, there's a major stumbling block that faces humanity, and that is that we're being told by mainstream media and astronomy that advanced life probably only exists on Earth, and there is no evidence of UFOs or ETs coming here. Meanwhile, looking at the actual abundant evidence of UFO and ET interactions, it becomes clear that not only do they exist, that they've been interacting for thousands of years, but also they've been communicating with us in many forms. This can be from physical contact with abductees, contactees, and certain military personnel, communicating either verbally, telepathically, or via projected imagery, through to the complex SETI-like symbolism of the genuine crop formations. So if we are to understand the motives and agendas of the different ET beings, we need to interpret these communications and also learn how we can communicate back. So what I want to do with this talk is to initially highlight some significant ET interactions through history, and then to look at the specific types of communication so we can understand what is going on here. Now, the more you look into the UFO and ET reality, it becomes clear that we've had interactions through the whole of human history. Certainly when you look at the Sumerian texts from people like translations by Zecharia Sitchin and others, it's clear that we've had these interactions with the Anunnaki, the gods that came to Earth and genetically engineered the modern humans. Now, that information comes from the translations of the cylinder seal imagery or the cuneiform writing. And funnily enough, cuneiform is regarded as the first form of written language. So whether that was created by the locals or a derivative of an extraterrestrial language is quite interesting. But certainly there are many people who feel that some of the pharaohs, the Egyptian pharaohs, may well have been of an extraterrestrial origin. And also that they had advanced technology, technologies that generally we're not allowed to know about. This is a classic example, one of these carvings that show this unusual object. What is this? Is this something for light or for heat or a communication device? In fact, there are some people who feel that the Ark of the Covenant may have been a communication device. But of all the pharaohs that you would believe may have been an extraterrestrial, that would have to be Pharaoh Akhenaten. Now, when you look at the statues of him and the carvings of him, he has a really unusual body form, including this elongated skull. And in fact, there are carvings such as this, where he has his children, and his children also have these elongated skulls. What is really interesting is that one of Akhenaten's children was actually Tutankhamun. And there's been some incredible state-of-the-art medical scans done of Tutankhamun's mummy, and it actually shows that the skull of Tutankhamun is actually elongated as well. And this is an illustration from that on the bottom right, and you can see it's completely different from a normal human skull above it. Now, of course, the pyramids were sort of a favoured form of construction by the ancients, and this is not only in Egypt, but also around the world, places like China, Bosnia, and of course certainly the pyramids here at Teotihuacan in Mexico. But you would certainly have to say that the modern era of ufology began in early July 1947 with the crash of the UFO in Roswell, New Mexico. And in fact, although most people have heard of the Roswell incident, many people aren't aware that there are now hundreds of witnesses that have actually spoken out about the fact that they are aware that this was an ET event, either first, second, or third-hand witnesses. One of those is Colonel Phil Corso, who saw one of the bodies not long after the crash, and it very clearly was like a grey alien. Colonel Phil Corso ended up working for the Army's Research and Development Department at the Pentagon in the early 1960s. And he said that it was his job to seed some of the technology from the crashed UFO at Roswell into mainstream industry through the government contracting programs, some of the technology that we're familiar with today. Now, what is interesting, and following on from Roswell, certainly for me, the 1950s were a major time of contact and communication. There were many, many incidents around the world, including in July 1952, there were over 500 UFO sightings in the USA, including about 70 over Washington, D.C. On the 26th of July 52, there were 12 UFOs seen and filmed over Capitol Hill and the White House, and these were tracked on 3 different radar systems, including from Andrews Air Force Base. Now, a few weeks later, after this, in September of 1952, was Operation Mainbrace. This was a major military exercise in the North Sea, Scandinavian and Baltic waters. And in fact, this was the biggest military exercise since the Second World War. And it involved military forces from Britain, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Holland, Norway, Portugal and the USA, with about 200 ships, 1,000 planes, and 80,000 men, including the USS Franklin D. Roosevelt aircraft carrier, which was the first ship to carry nuclear weapons, and I think that was relevant. During the maneuvers, there were many UFOs and unidentified submersible objects that were recorded, including luminous triangular objects, disc-shaped objects rising out of the sea, and a quarter-mile wide underwater object tracked following the carrier that then flew out of the sea. Now, there are witnesses that have alleged on the 20th of February 1954, President Eisenhower met with human-like extraterrestrials that arrived in 5 UFOs which landed at Muroc, which became Edwards Air Force Base in California. The aliens apparently spoke English, and part of their communication was the nuclear program should be stopped, then they would help introduce clean technology and have a proper first contact scenario. Apparently this offer was declined. There are other witnesses that have said that the following year, in 1955, Eisenhower had another meeting at Holloman Air Force Base with, again, human-type ETs. So when people say, well, if UFOs exist, why don't they land on the White House lawn? In a way, they already have. Now, the 50s and then into the 60s was a time of contact, not only with the military, but with civilians, with the classic contactees, people like George Adamski, etc. But also, probably late 50s and the 60s was the beginnings of the alien abduction phenomena, where people were taken on board craft, had the usual medical procedures, etc. But certainly the first published case of abduction was that of the famous Barney and Betty Hill case from September 1961 from New Hampshire, where again they were taken on board, had the certain medical procedures, etc. But as this talk is about communication, what is interesting is that Betty was shown a map, a star map, that she was told highlighted the main routes that these beings were taking between star systems. She could remember that very clearly after the abduction, and she drew this down. Later, that star map was actually identified, that the particular stars were identified by an astronomer, Marjorie Fish, and it showed up at the top right the sun, our solar system, in that map, but the main routes they were taking regularly was between Zeta Reticulum 1 and 2, as though that was possibly where their home system, home star system was. Now, probably one of the most important abductions that have happened is known as the witness case. The reason why this is so important is because this happened in downtown New York on the 30th of November 1989, but it involved many witnesses that saw this, including certain world leaders and political figures. And where this happened, there we go. This is a picture that I took from one of the Twin Towers, strangely enough, talking of which. And where this actually happened, this is in downtown New York, and that's the Brooklyn Bridge here. 3 o'clock in the morning on the 30th of November 1989, suddenly the power cut out in this general area here. All the lights went out, but also all the engines cut out as well in the cars. People were watching as a UFO hovered above one of these brown buildings, a beam of light shining down, and suddenly 4 figures in a curled-up fetal position, which is really strange, beamed up in the beam into the craft. The craft then took off and flew over the Brooklyn Bridge and then dropped into the East River beyond. After a while, the lights started to come back on, and people found they could start their cars in a state of shock, as you can imagine, at what they'd seen. Now, this is where this stepped up to a higher level. 30 November 1989, was a really important day in world politics. This is when the Berlin Wall was literally collapsing. The Russian state was falling. On that very day, President Gorbachev met the Pope, and this was the first time a Russian president had met the Pope for 70 years. The following day, Gorbachev actually had a meeting with George Bush Sr., the president, in Malta. So there was a lot of stuff going on around the world, and there were major meetings happening at the United Nations buildings in New York. Now, in the early hours of the morning, after this meeting, there was a cavalcade of limousines driving from the UN buildings where these world leaders, political figures, were driving down through Manhattan to go to stay at Governor's Island on the southern tip of Manhattan, when they were also caught up with this. And this involved people like Lech Wałęsa, the Polish leader, the UN Secretary General, etc., and other people. The same thing happened. The power cut out. The cars ground to a halt, these limousines. You can imagine them panicking, thinking there's some sort of terrorist event. Then they were much closer to where this occurred, so they could see it a lot closer. These two drawings were sent to the researcher of this case, which was the late Bud Hopkins, and it's known as the witness case. These drawings were sent by a guy called Richard, who was proven to have been the national security, NSA guard, guarding the UN Secretary General. And he said they were below the building, but he had binoculars, so he drew this. Again, showing that these four figures came out curled up in this fetal position, which is really strange, but all the witnesses were saying the same, and it seemed to add weight to its reality. Then they all straightened up, all pointing in the direction of these world leaders. They could clearly see one was human, and that's the abductee, using the pseudonym of Linda Cortile, and then three greys, as we know them now. They beamed up into the craft then took off again, went over the bridge, and then into the river beyond. Now again, after a while, the lights came back on, and these world leaders could continue their journey in a state of shock, as you can imagine. So the general feeling is that this was done deliberately by these beings so that these world leaders would know not only that they exist, but the capabilities they have. And you can well imagine the meetings that would have gone on behind the scenes, you know, in the military world, the UN world, and political sort of meetings. So over the years, decades of research, it's become clear that there's certainly more than one race of ETs interacting with us. In fact, Command Sergeant Major Bob Dean, who was an intelligence analyst at the SHAPE headquarters in Belgium, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, he had an above top secret clearance, and he said that in 1964 he came across the assessment document, and this was the assessment of the extraterrestrial situation on Earth for those with a need to know. And he said even then in 64 they were aware of at least a dozen different races that were interacting with the human race. And again, a bit like humans, the general feeling is they fall into three categories. There are those you would say are negative, that have a negative intent towards us, are using us, possibly manipulating things from behind the scenes. Others seem to be here in a more observational capacity, as though they're watching, particularly at this time as we're going through these incredible technological and environmental changes. Thirdly, there are those that are here in a more benevolent capacity that probably want to see us evolve in a more spiritual direction. But just to highlight some of these, you've got the reptilian at the bottom, which is either a physical being or negative interdimensional entities. There are the greys as either tall greys or shorter greys, possibly automatons. At the top left, you've got the human figure. And what is interesting is that in the assessment document, the military were more concerned about the human types that look exactly like us, or we look like them, because they knew they could walk in the corridors of power, the White House, Pentagon, and you wouldn't know they were extraterrestrial. Then you've got the energy beings, and up at the top right, I show the picture of an angel, not because an angel is an extraterrestrial, but I think it's important if we're to truly understand what's going on here, we have to understand all the different levels. And for me, certainly, I believe angels are divine, spiritual beings that are very much concerned about the evolution of the soul, and they're to help people at pivotal moments within their life or at death, which is different from extraterrestrial interactions. And I think it's important we understand there is a difference. Then at the bottom, I show the military side of this. The military abductions, MILABs, And I think when disclosure happens, the general populace are going to become shocked not only to know that there are several different races interacting with us, but also that some areas of the Black Ops military have been working in conjunction with some of these beings, which again will be a bit of a shock to humanity when that's found out. So, how do we communicate with beings that either don't speak our languages, or who have no facial expressions or body language, or who use telepathy as a way of communicating? We're so used to facial expressions as a way of judging communication, emotions, and intent. And in a way, you can really see this. If you watch TV with no sound on, we still have a good idea of what's going on by the facial expressions and gesticulation. So how can we go about complex communications or negotiations with one or more alien races whose knowledge of our languages, cultures, and emotions is so much further ahead than our understanding of theirs? Now, ironically enough, we can actually use some incredible interspecies interactions and profound human and animal bonds that have happened as a way of highlighting that it is possible to communicate with other beings on a deep level, with or without verbal communication, just using body language and empathy. If humans and different species of animals, either pets or wild animals, can have close bonds and a sense of communication with each other, then this must hold us in good stead for interactions and communication with other beings not from this world. And as a classic example, there have been some incredible communications with chimpanzees and gorillas. One particular place in the States, they had a really complex communication using chimpanzees, where they're working with chimpanzees, where they were quite a complex sign language, or they were using images on cards, or even touchscreen computers, leading to quite a complex communication between the chimpanzees and the humans. So communication with ETs comes in many forms, depending on the intentions and motivations of those beings, why they are here and what they want. So what I want to do now is to talk about some of those particular types of communication that have happened. One is communication via actions, another a communication via language, literally, and also via telepathy, communication highlighting environmental concerns, communication via symbolism, particularly the crop formations, and then communication literally with the craft itself, with organic craft. So initially, communication via actions. One of the things that's been seen many times with military or commercial pilots is that UFOs often are able to preempt the actions of the pilots. And there are some incredible cases. Now, this is one of those amazing disclosures that happened at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., this particular one on the 12th of November 2007. I wish I had time to talk about all the people that were there. But to highlight this preempting of the actions, initially, this gentleman here below the sign, that is Commander Oscar Santamaria Huertas, who is a Peruvian pilot flying with the Peruvian military based at a base near Lima in Peru. In April 1980, he was scrambled to go and see an object that was hovering just near the end of the runway. Now, he was a Top Gun pilot, particularly with 30mm cannon, and he was authorized to fire on this object. So as he approached, he said he actually fired 30mm cannon, hit the object. He expected it to explode. And he said that didn't actually happen. He thought it would either explode or the bullets would possibly ricochet off. Neither of that happened. The bullets themselves, he said, literally disappeared as though they were absorbed into this object. This object then took off at speed. He chased it. He then approached again at the point that he could fire. He was just about to fire, and then this object ascended to a higher altitude. He went up higher, approached again a second time, was just about to fire, and it ascended at that moment into a higher altitude again. Third time, he approached again. Just as he was about to fire, it ascended yet again to a higher altitude. He ended up at 63,000 feet, by which time he was dangerously running out of fuel, so he had to return immediately back to base. As he turned around and came back, he flew past this object, and he said that it then became very clear it was a UFO. It was the classic sort of 30-foot across disc. Now, there have been other cases where pilots have tried to fire on objects as well. This is another one here. This is General Parviz Jafari, an Iranian pilot from their military. Back in 1976, he was based at an operation near Tehran. And he said he was scrambled also to go and look at an object, with brightly illuminated object. As he approached, suddenly a ball of light came out of that object straight towards his aircraft. He said he thought he was being attacked, so he had lock-on with missiles, and at the point he was about to fire, all of his electrical systems and his communication systems in the aircraft cut out. Now, this you can sort of understand, because it would have been electrical systems that were going out for advanced technology to register that. But with the Peruvian case, as the pilot said himself, this was mechanical. It was not with electrics. So they clearly were able to recognize at the point that he was about to fire, and the feeling is that they registered that by reading his mind telepathically. Now again, the more you look into the UFO and ET reality, one of the most consistent types of interaction that have happened over many decades have been UFOs hovering over nuclear installations, either nuclear power stations or military bases housing nuclear weapons. And probably one of the most famous cases is that of this gentleman, Captain Robert Salas. He was a launch control officer based at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, when in March of 1967, UFOs were seen around the base, and one UFO actually hovered outside the main gate. And suddenly, at his location, 10 nuclear missiles all deactivated. Now, he said there is no way should that have happened, because they had backup systems and backup generators. And once again, it became very clear that this was ufological, that they had caused this deactivation. And you can imagine the meetings that would have gone on behind the scenes about this particular case. Some people, again, depending on the opinion, would have seen this as a way of these objects highlighting that there is an issue, a problem with nuclear technology. Others may have said that this was like a military threat, depending on the opinions of those that were discussing this. But it would have been discussed at very high levels. And of course, in the UK, probably one of the most important cases, UFO cases here, was that of the Rendlesham Forest incident that happened towards the end of December 1980. There were many interactions that happened between the twin US military bases of Bentwaters and Woodbridge, and interactions within the forest and the field beyond. And this involved a triangular craft landing in the forest, where US military personnel approached the object and actually touched it. There was a large ball of light that was seen splitting into 5, flying in different directions. There was balls of light flying through the forest between the trees themselves. And also a UFO that hovered above the weapons storage area that shone a beam of light down right into the weapons storage area where the nuclear missiles were held. And on another occasion where a group of US military personnel, a UFO hovered above them and shone a beam of light down right in front of the feet of the Deputy Base Commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt. So clearly they were aware of who the commanding officer was among those men. Now, I highly recommend that you see Gary Hesseltine's talk tomorrow, same time tomorrow, because he's going to go much more in depth about his research into this case. If we are to talk about the actions of extraterrestrials, one of those things we have to discuss is that of the animal mutilations as well. Another area that a lot of people don't necessarily want to talk about, but there's a huge amount of research that shows that some of these animals it's not natural predation that's been happening to these animals all around the world over many decades, and the wounds are basically like laser-like surgery. And I mentioned earlier on about Colonel Phil Corso from the Pentagon's, the research department, the Army's research and department of the Pentagon. And he actually said that animal mutilations were done by EBIs, extraterrestrial biological entities, and that the military, were aware of this since at least the early 1950s. And he said that they basically were harvesting the digestive, mammary, and reproductive organs, also draining all the bodily fluids and blood. Their laser surgery had virtually no inflammatory response. So the general feeling is that certainly the ovum and fluids were used for the development of the embryos in the ET human hybridization process. Again, so these are different types of actions, and from that we can try and judge, the intent, the motives of these beings. But then we have communication via language. This is literally where some ETs, human-type ETs, look like us and have interacted. I mentioned earlier on with George Adamski in the 1950s and 60s. Now, he went through the usual ridicule that many people do regarding this subject, but there were many people who wrote affidavits to say that George Adamski had had these meetings with these beings. He also ended up having a meeting with President Eisenhower about this, and an audience with Pope John the 23rd. So there's no way would he be having meetings with those sort of people about this subject unless there was something to this. Now, of course, the beings that he spoke to, as he was American, they were speaking in English. But then you have, like, the Billy Meyer case in Switzerland, where the human types there are speaking Swiss. And in Italy, it's a case that we're not so familiar with in Britain, but it's known as the Amicizia case. And this is where human-type beings from, again, the 50s onwards, over many years, were interacting with some leading figures in Italy, from political figures, business people, academics, and certainly around the Pescara area, which is on the eastern coast of Italy. It said that they had underground and undersea bases. Now, interestingly enough, amicizia in Italian means friendship. So you can see how these people felt about those particular beings. But for me, probably one of the most incredible cases is that of the Carlos Diaz case in Mexico. And this is a photograph taken by Carlos Diaz in 1981 from a place called Tepoztlan, which is just south of Mexico City, where he first saw this object. And they're known as sort of, well, a plasma craft or jellyfish craft. It's as though they're made of energy, like organic, highly advanced, sentient thinking technology. Over the years, he took many photographs and film footage of this, and he ended up meeting the beings from these craft. And on one particular occasion, the human type said to him, "Meet us tomorrow in a particular village." So the following day, he went there and met this person. And as he arrived, that person was speaking to some of the children. And so clearly, he was talking in Mexican. One of the things they said to him was, "Carlos, it's important you understand that everything is connected, from a blade of grass to the fields, to the oceans and the life forms in the oceans, planetary systems, galaxies, and then even interdimensional reality beyond. Everything is connected, and cause and effect is real." This is one of the things that really stimulated Carlos to be very concerned about environmental issues, which he spoke about a lot. But generally, one of the most consistent forms of communication that abductees, contactees, and military personnel have experienced while interacting with ETs has been telepathy. Various types of extraterrestrial have the ability to communicate via thought, with images, words, and feelings being received by the recipient, and the ETs are also able to perceive the thoughts and feelings of the human as well. This bypasses the complication of language translation, but also seems to override the masks and idiosyncrasies of the individual, certainly the human, getting to the deeper feeling behind the words. However, as most humans are not adept at communicating telepathically, it is difficult to know exactly what the extraterrestrial being is actually thinking. It seems the communications are on their terms, not ours. Now, there are many abductees that were taken on board craft that saw these banks of containers holding basically embryos within the liquid that were clearly human hybrid embryos. Certainly in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, particularly female abductees would be shown these and often told that one of those embryos is actually from their own genetic material. At a later date, they'd be taken back on board the craft and then be shown small children, which again were clearly hybrid, human-alien hybrids. And the children seemed really listless. And they were actually encouraged, again telepathically, to bond with that child, to play with it, to sort of love it. And it seemed to re-energize the children, as though that bonding, that close proximity and loving actually gave energy to the hybrid. But another aspect to these interactions that happened, over many years, abductees were believing that they were being implanted. And then people started to have X-rays for ordinary things, for other operations or whatever, and they would find metallic objects under the skin. So then the brilliant work of the late Dr. Roger Lear, he was a podiatric surgeon in California. He was fascinated by this subject, so he actually agreed to do surgery on abductees that met certain criteria and to remove these objects, which he did. And he actually worked with 17 abductees, removing up to 20 implants. When they tested these in laboratories, it showed that some of the metal components of these implants were artificially put together and that their isotopic ratio was not from Earth. So in other words, they were of an extraterrestrial origin. Now, the general feeling is that these implants were put into people as a way of tracking people, so they could be tracked wherever they were, or as a way of checking their metabolism, or possibly in a little bit more scary way, as a remote influencing device. But again, if we're talking about communication, another form of communication that's very much like telepathy is actually channeling. But this again is a sort of a mutual communication, trying to reach a higher level of consciousness. So again, you're all aware of this, that the channeler has to get into the right meditative state, opening the chakras, bringing in the divine light, and trying to reach that high level of consciousness for a communication that you would trust. But then you've got these various different types of communication, but then there have been interactions that seem to highlight the fact that we have an environmental problem, and that's becoming very clear now, of course. Again, late 80s, early 90s particularly, many abductees, contactees, channelers were being given information that up ahead we are going to go through massive environmental devastation. And in fact, some abductees were shown this on screens or even experienced traumatically via holographic projections. And they were given information about these various things that were going to happen. Of course, as time has passed, it's becoming clearer that we have real issues with the environment. And in a way, this was highlighted by one of the classic events, which was known as the Masters of the Stars event. And this is when, on the 11th of July 1991, over Mexico City, as there was a total solar eclipse, and during the middle of the day when it went completely dark with the eclipse, suddenly UFOs started to appear in the skies over Mexico City. People were taking photographs and filming this, thousands of people. It was only after the event it was realized that it actually fulfilled a 1,200-year-old Mayan prophecy that said on the birth of that particular sun, when the sun comes out from behind the moon, the Masters of the Stars will return to Earth to herald the dawn of a new age of cosmic awareness and of Earth changes. And that's exactly what was going on at that time. This was 1991. People were waking up all over the world. Crop formations were starting to develop. People were realizing that UFOs and ETs are real. But also, people starting to become more aware of environmental issues and problems that are going to develop over time. There have also been witnesses to ETs that seem to be collecting samples as though they're checking for pollution or radioactivity. And there's one particular case where I met the witness. This is a lady that lives in a tiny village called Monkton Farley, which is not far from Bath. It's also quite close to Corsham. And of course, Corsham has the deep underground military base at RAF Rudloe Manor. In fact, I spoke to two people that worked there, and they both said that underground at Rudloe Manor, the roads under there, it's like a city, the roads under there go for miles. And there are some people who felt that possibly that was a bit like the British Area 51. So this village is not far from that. Now, this happened in the late summer of 1998, and the lady said that during the night they were awoken when their room was flooded with light, whereas normally it's pitch black at night. So her and her husband went to the window to see what was going on, and at the bottom of their garden, as it joined a field, there was a small UFO hovering or just landed on the grass into the field. She said it was probably about 10 feet across, but was really unusual because it was translucent. She could actually see through this as though it was made of glass. Inside, she said there was one being, and this is her drawing, a bit like a grey but more stocky. She said there was one being inside and 3 other beings outside, close to the craft, that seemed to be moving quickly around the craft. Now, a lot of abductees have said this when they've seen these beings moving. They move in a quick way that seems unusual. So again, often the feeling is that possibly they are automatons. But while they watched, these beings were actually bending down, and it seemed that they were picking up grass samples, which again she intuitively felt was they were checking for pollution, radioactivity, whatever. As they watched, these 3 beings then went back inside the craft, so now there were 4 in there. The object lifted up about 10 feet off the ground silently and then instantaneously accelerated to the right, again in silence. Truly a profound thing to see. Now, talking about this sort of communication regarding impending current and impending environmental catastrophes, another that had a communication about that was Whitley Strieber, which you're all familiar with, I'm sure. In 1998, Whitley had a meeting with a human type that he felt, although he looked like us and was physical, he felt he was of non-earthly origin or interdimensional in nature, as he said. And he was given such technical information about the things that were going to happen as we go through these changes, so much so that he then ended up writing this book, The Coming Global Superstorm, in collaboration with Art Bell. Now, what's interesting is that this book became the foundation for the movie The Day After Tomorrow, which again was highlighting the fact that you're going to have very quick change, devastating change, particularly if the ocean conveyor currents collapse with the melting of the pole caps and things like that. And again, we're starting to see that happen now. But there's even stranger stuff than that. We're becoming very aware of the extinction of many species over a very short period of time. But there's also this weird stuff, this species-specific die-offs that have been happening. Many of those, most of that is just over a few-month period, end of 2010 into 2011. I wish I, again, had time to tell you about all of these. But it's strange because one species dies in one location. So again, if it was toxicity or pollution, you expect all creatures to die in that area. But it's really weird. As an example, at the top, you've got thousands of octopuses washed ashore dead just on one beach in Portugal. Further down, billions of anchovies found dead floating in one harbour in California. And all of those are like that. They're just one type of species dying in one particular location. It's very strange. And on the right-hand side, also, where you have birds, where you have flocks of birds that just fall dead out of the sky. Again, when they're checked, they're healthy birds generally, and they're just literally falling straight out of the sky, down into trees and onto pavements and things like this. So there's something very strange going on. But certainly, as far as the environmental issues, we're starting to see that now with like forest fires in these superheating conditions through Europe, States, Australia, etc. Hurricanes, tornadoes, and also then we have these super freezing events, these extremes in the other direction. This is a classic example of a photograph I took in end of Feb 2018 near where I live. This is during that beast from the east when there was freezing that was going, really unusual all the way down Italy and throughout Europe. But here, all the waterfalls completely frozen. So it's these extremes that I think people were being advised about, as preparation for these changes. Now, another form of communication that has happened is that of symbolism. And that, of course, has to apply to crop formations, which really is the classic communication that's happened. Now, most of you here are familiar with the crop formations. But for those of you that are not, I want to particularly highlight, and I think it's important to reiterate, the SETI communications that happened via the crop formations. Now, you're all aware of the SETI program, which is the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which is using radio telescopes around the world to listen into, hopefully, a signal from an advanced race giving intelligent communication. But of course, the SETI program is run by NASA, and NASA is run by the military. So the chances are, if we received an intelligent communication via telescopes, the chances are we wouldn't be told about it. So what was fascinating is there was a 3-year period from August 2000, then 2001 and 2002 that sort of stepped this up to that higher level. And This is the radio telescope at Chilbolton, which is south of Andover in Hampshire. And in August of 2000, this formation here appeared right next to the radio telescope. And this was very much highlighting the dish of the radio telescope with the antenna in the middle, and then this sort of planetary or cosmic communication going into the dish. And the feeling was that that knowledge that we wouldn't be told about it via the radio telescope, that one being on government land, but by having the formations in the fields of the world, it allowed ordinary people to be able to access information. So the following year, in the same place, virtually the same date, two formations appeared. The one you just saw was about here. This one appeared up here, which was like a face, a human or humanoid face, which you can only see from the air. The other one, pointing straight at the radio telescope, is based on a binary code message that was sent into space by the SETI program back in November 1974. And yet there are anomalies within the formation, and of course the anomalies are what you would look at for that communication. Now, as an example, the face. Now, the further back you are, or if you squint your eyes, you'll actually see that it brings up a sort of a more photographically real image of a human or humanoid face you can only see from the air. The next one is this formation, which is about 250 feet in length, and based on this binary code message, which was sent from the Arecibo radio telescope in Puerto Rico back in November 1974. Now, to give you an idea of what that was, this on the right is the translation of that binary code message, and on the left is a block form of that, so you can actually compare to the crop formation in a second. But just as an example of the information that was in that, at the bottom you've got a little graphic of the Arecibo telescope saying this is where this was sent from, with the dish and the antenna. Above it you've got the solar system with the third planet raised up, saying this is the planet of life where we, the human figure, comes from. And above that you've got the double helix of DNA, the number of nucleotides in DNA, formulas for sugars and bases and nucleotides of DNA, etc. This is an intelligent communication sent into space. So now if you look at the one on the left, the block form, which is this, and then if you zigzag backwards and forwards, you start to see the anomalies, and that is what you would look at for your communication. Now, there are quite a few in there, but I just want to highlight some. One, as an example, is the DNA structure. You can see is more advanced. So the feeling is, what that was trying to say is that ET DNA is more advanced, or even the human hybrid alien DNA is more advanced. Below that, instead of the human figure, there is a little image of what looks like a grey, small body but the large cranium. Below that, instead of the Earth raised up, there are 3 areas raised up. And that's basically saying that there's life in all these areas. The Earth, third planet raised up, we know. Beyond that is Mars. And there have been some incredible photographs taken in Mars. It's become clear that Mars used to have vast rivers, lakes, and oceans. It was a water world in the past. And photographs of what looked like vegetation on Mars, but also the artificial pyramidal structures as well. Some people feel that Mars may well have had an advanced civilization in the past. And then beyond that, you've got the 4 dots there, which presumably relate to the 4 Galilean moons around Jupiter. Certainly Europa, the ice world that has liquid water underneath, there are many microbiologists now, astronomers, thinking there may well be microbiological life, at least in that liquid water. And then at the bottom, the pièce de résistance of this is a little mini graphic of the crop formation that appeared there the year before, the one that I just showed you with the dish and that sort of planetary communication. So the general feeling is what they were trying to say is that not only that ETs exist, but they are trying to communicate with us. Now, as if that wasn't enough, you've now got a 2D binary code communication. Then the following year, again virtually to the day, in August of 2002, just 8 miles down the road, underneath a bank of microwave towers, and the SETI program looks into the microwave spectrum as well as the radio spectrum, you then had this incredible photographically real image. Now, once again, the further back you are, or if you squint your eyes, You see it really comes out with that photographically like image of one of these beings, a grey. Just made up from many lines of depressed crop. It's incredible. Even if you look on the right-hand side, it's like shading on the cheek. I don't know how that was done. This is about 350 feet in length. If you look up the top there, you see a car on that road, so it gives you an idea of how big these are. And it's just underneath this bank of microwave towers up here. Now, this seems to be holding up this disk. And in fact, when this appeared around about the 25th anniversary of the Voyager probes that went out into space that had that golden disk on board with people speaking, children talking, music playing, greetings in 54 Earth languages to go out into space. And so looking at that, people think that may well be a disk of communication. Now, it's really complex. It's actually, some people think it's circles, but it's actually a spiral of crop that starts in the middle and flows all the way out and ends up at the bottom there. I actually walked that, and it's on a sloping field, quite steeply sloping field. It took me about 15 or 20 minutes to walk, so that must be the equivalent of about a mile in length. So a spiral, a mile in length on a sloping field, you'd have a job to do a spiral even in a computer, let alone on a field. But even more complex is the fact that the dark areas are standing crop and the light areas are laid crop. But wherever you go in that spiral, they all point into the center. So it's really complex. So again, the feeling was that this was a disk of communication. So using the ASCII code in the computer, this was actually translated. And it says, "Beware the bearers of false gifts and their broken promises. Much pain but still time. Believe there is good out there. We oppose deception. Conduit closing." Now, that's a really powerful message. There are a lot of people who feel that as we're going through these environmental and technological changes, that these beings, the Greys, are here to help us as we go through that. Other people feel that, in fact, a bit like the message, that they are the classic deceivers. They're not to be trusted, and they are taking material from us or possibly manipulating things from behind the scenes, and therefore not to be trusted. I personally would go along with the latter. I would not trust these beings. But when and if disclosure happens, again, as people become more aware of this subject and that there are different ET races interacting with us, people are going to have to choose within their own hearts what they believe about the different types of beings and their agendas. Now, this is another one of Steve Alexander's amazing pictures from temporarytemples.co.uk. And as you look at that, you see how 3D that is. That really is quite incredible. The formation appeared in August of 2012, not far south of Swindon. But again, really 3D. And the feeling was this was trying to highlight the fact that we need to be, it was like a warning, we need to be aware of nanoparticles which are starting to enter into biological cells. Nanoparticles of silver that are being used in clothing, etc. And also nanotechnology as well. And this sort of line here, this thin line here, as though that nanotechnology was entering into a biological cell. But the fact that silver particles are even appearing in clothing, if you look, the crop itself around this was actually woven like cloth. Truly profound. And you can see how 3D that is. But again, the feeling is that regarding nanotechnology, nanoparticles, we now have the same problem now. We're becoming more aware of the plastic pollution problem and the fact that microparticles of plastic are starting to appear even in plankton, fish, whales and dolphins, and of course us as we ingest. So there's a real problem. So in a way, this crop formation actually should have come under the concern about environmental issues, but very profound image. But crop formations themselves were even more than just amazing geometry, mathematics, and SETI communications. There was a telepathic aspect to it as well. Certainly in the early 90s to mid-90s, some of the main researchers into crop formations were finding this sort of telepathic component. If a person was thinking about a particular image, that image would then inexplicably appear the following day in a field. Or this led to people starting to meditate on a particular image, which also would then inexplicably appear the following day, as though telepathically the thoughts were being read. This then led to the CE5 communications, particularly people like Dr. Stephen Greer and others, where they would have a group of people getting into a meditative state to try and have a higher level of consciousness, and would then be able to communicate via bright lights with orbs of light, or even with illuminated objects creating images up in the sky. Now, of course, CE5, CE3 is contact, CE4 is abduction, and then CE5 is the, this benevolent mutual communication. So, we now have communication with organic craft. This is where this steps up to an even higher level, where there's literally a communication with the craft itself. Now, I mentioned earlier on about the amazing case in Mexico at Tepoztlan with Carlos Diaz and others. It's estimated now that there are about 12,000 people that have acknowledged seeing these really unusual organic craft in this place of Tepoztlan. And I actually went there in March of 2014. It's a really beautiful place. It's known as a sacred valley and within the mountains. And I actually spoke to a witness who just the month before, so this is February 2014, had seen not just one of these objects, but there were 3 of them hovering silently at the edge of the village. Himself and his wife and other people were watching this. And then after about 20 minutes or so, they then silently moved away to their right, just below the mountains. Now, what was interesting is, I mentioned about Carlos Diaz. On one particular occasion, he was taken on board one of these orangey-yellow plasma craft, and inside, he said it was like this. It's the same colour. He couldn't really see outside. So he actually thought to himself, he knew he was going somewhere, so he thought to himself, I wonder where I am. And at that exact moment that he thought that, suddenly the craft became translucent, and he could actually see out of the craft. He was passing slowly over a jungle, and he said he was taken to a beach where he suddenly became very aware of the aura or the energy around all life forms. This was around the crabs on the beach, the birds, the trees, the plants themselves. He could see this energy, this aura around them. This again was one of the things that stimulated Carlos to really be very concerned about the environmental issues. Thank you. Now, what's interesting is some craft that have been taken in the possession of some of the military. In the early days, 50s, 60s, they had these keypads, often had fingerprint impressions in there, where the ETs could control or navigate the craft. There were also headsets for communication with the craft directly. Beyond that, even telepathic communication. And this is why some of the military were interested in psychics, because they knew that psychics were much more adept at communicating telepathically. But these sort of organic jellyfish-type craft have been seen all around the world, particularly over Mexico, where in some cases they've been filmed birthing these orbs of light that come out of it. In fact, some cases where there's more orbs coming out than the size of the object itself, which is incredible. In March of 2008, September 2008, my wife and I went to Madeira. It's a beautiful island. While we were there, we went up into the mountains, and the mountains really reminded us of the topography of Tepoztlan that you just saw a little while ago. Very similar mountains. And because of that, we started to talk about the plasma craft, saying how incredible they are, these organic, sentient craft, beyond metallic technology, and how amazing it would be if we could see something like that. Now, the very next photograph I took came out with this incredible object here. Now, this is not a balloon or a ball on a cable or anything. This is actually hovering over the valley. But it's that really organic look to it. But it also had this really strange sort of white oblong on top, which was catching the sun. When I saw that, the two of us, we were really humbled by that, because we felt it was like a response to a heartfelt request to see one of these things. But again, the question is this actually a technology or is it a life form? There are people like Trevor James Constable from 50s, 60s in California who used to take photographs of these objects that he used to call sky critters. They're sometimes called sky medusa, which is sky jellyfish. He said you're more likely to see them, take photographs of them, if you take them in the infrared or out in space in the ultraviolet, sort of outside our spectrum. So the feeling is that if they're life forms, that they may exist outside the visual spectrum, but they may be living within the atmosphere or out in space. So again, this highlights the fact that there's so much more to the nature of reality than we are being told. This is another brilliant painting by my wife, Philippa, and at this point I just want to thank her for all the incredible illustrations and design within this presentation. Thank you. This picture is called Europa, and it's based on the liquid water under the moon, and that there may be either microbiological life or more advanced life in that water. And this harks back to the crop formation I showed you earlier that seemed to be alluding to the fact that there's life within the Galilean moons. We now have over 4,000 planets that have been found, extrasolar planets. And astronomers are starting to realize that when you look up at the sky now at stars, most stars will have planetary systems. Therefore, as you look up, you're actually looking at more planets than you are stars. So this makes it much easier for us to talk about these subjects as people start to become aware there's more likelihood of worlds out there that may well have more advanced civilizations. And yet, we are still being told by mainstream astronomy and media that, if anything, there may only be microbiological life out there, while we're actually being visited by advanced civilizations. So, with all this accrued knowledge and information, many of the ET motivations still remain a mystery, and there often seem to be contradictions and possible deception involved in some of the more physical interactions, certainly. If some ET races have been interacting with humanity for thousands of years, as appears to be the case, it is highly likely they understand how to read and even simulate or trigger human emotions and have learnt our languages. They could well be able to use this knowledge to manipulate outcomes. So, if we want to negotiate with them as equals, not subordinates, humanity needs to work out how to read their intentions and respond intelligently in any future negotiations. And I think this is very relevant. There are more and more people out around the world, from contactees, abductees, channelers, researchers, experiencers, people working within, say, the Exopolitics Institute, and those looking even to exo-consciousness, higher levels of consciousness, not only within ourselves, but out into space, other races, etc. There is a real feeling that we are at a time now when we should be allowed to evolve. This information is out there and it is our birthright, but hopefully to interact with benevolent beings where we're not subordinate. Okay, this is the final slide. So what I've tried to do with this talk is to highlight the fact that UFOs and ETs exist. That now is undeniable. There are many different types of interactions and types of communication, which I've shown some tonight. There are the interactions, the preempting. There's the actual communication with beings where they speak our languages, have voice boxes like us, telepathic communication, and of course the crop formations as a form of communication as well. I think the more that we understand all these areas, as well as everything that's been spoken this weekend, it's much easier for us to go through this incredible transition that we're in now, and will help us as we go through those changes. Thank you very much.